From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming here today to our panel discussion on primary source research on North Korea. This is organized with the help of the Library of Congress as a part of my organization, the National Committee on North Korea's Knowing North Korea workshop for students and young professionals. We're very excited to have a really great panel here today talking about the diverse sources that exist for doing primary source research on North Korea. Speaking first will be Sonia Lee, who will discuss the Library of Congress's collection of North Korean publications. Sonia is a Korea reference specialist at the Scholarly Service section of the Asia Division here at the Library of Congress. She graduated from the University of California, Los Angeles with a Master of Information Science degree and has worked at the Library of Congress since 1995. As the recommending officer of the Korean collection in the Asian Division, Lee has helped build the Korean collection of approximately 300,000 volumes of monographs and over 7,600 periodical titles as of today, including 281 serial titles from North Korea. Lee's been especially concerned with increasing the research content of the North Korean materials, as well as making the collections available through cataloging and outreach. In 2018 this year, she completed a long-term project, the North Korea Serials Indexing Database, which improved access to North Korean serials and items. The North Korean Serials Indexing Database lets researchers and scholars study North Korea in unusual depth. And up next will be Eric Van Slander of the National Archives and Reference Administration. Eric is reference archivist in the Textual Reference Services Division at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, where he specializes in records related to World War II, the Allied occupations of Japan and South Korea, and the Korean War. Mr. Van Slanders worked at the National Archives in various capacities since 2001. He has bachelor's and master's of arts degrees in history from the City University of New York City College, a Master of Library Science degree from the University of Maryland College Park, and is currently pursuing a Doctor of Liberal Studies degree at Georgetown University. And James Person, who will be speaking about the translated diplomatic documents available from North Korea's former allies in the Eastern Bloc and former Soviet Union, is a professor of Korean Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Before joining SAIS in 2017, he served as the founding director of the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. Between 2007 and early 2016, he was the founding coordinator of the Wilson Center's North Korea International Documentation Project, where he oversaw the development of a database featuring tens of thousands of declassified documents from the archives of North Korea's former communist allies. Between 2013 and early 2017, he was also deputy director of the History and Public Policy program at the Wilson Center. Person holds a PhD in modern Korean history from the George Washington University. He also holds an MPhil in history from Moscow State University and a BA in history and fine arts from the George Washington University. Person's presently completing a book that explores the transformation of North Korea's political and ideological systems between 1953 and 1967. And before we start with the panel, I'd like to introduce Chi Chu, who's head of the Scholarly Services section of the Asian Division at the Library of Congress, for some introductory remarks. So, thank you, Chi.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm just here to welcome everyone to the Library of Congress for this, on behalf of the Asian Division. It's our pleasure to co-host this panel presentation with the National Committee on North Korea as part of the workshop on North Korean research. If you are familiar with the Library of Congress Asian materials, you probably know that here at the library, the Asian Reading Room is where you can find abundant North Korean materials. And here is just a glimpse of what we have in our rich collection. But if you are not familiar with our resources, no worries. That's pretty much why you are here, right? Our specialist, Sonia Li, will give you an introduction in just a few minutes. So beyond Korean materials, users can also access about 4 million physical items in over 130 vernacular languages in the Asian Reading Room. The Asian Reading Room is just located in the other side of the building, also on the first floor. In addition to physical items, we also offer access to digital materials, and users can get research assistance from our special subject specialists. These materials include most subject fields and cover a geographic area ranging from the South Asian subcontinent and Southeast Asia to East Asia. So if you have any questions on using our collections or reading rooms, please feel free to talk to me or talk to any of our librarians today, or check out our website. I know probably you will not have time to come to our reading room after this event today, but I hope in the near future you will be able to come to the library and the Asian Reading Room soon. So yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Sonia Lee, reference specialist at the Korean Collection Library of Congress. Once a North Korean scholar told me that our North Korean materials is like a playground. And today my job is to help you to figure out how to search around in that playground. And I'll share with you the North Korean resource materials at the Library of Congress and help you to figure out how to use it. But before start talking about Korean collection, let me start with a brief summary of the Korean collection. 1950, libraries started to collect the Korean material during the Korean War. Then the Korean unit was the only location among the United States government collect the materials about Korea. So any request related to Korea sent to the Korean unit, thus the make a collection quickly developed. 1955, the library started to use a vendor in South Korea to systematically and regularly acquire the contemporary publication. 1966 is an important year for the Korean collection. The United States and South Korean government signed the exchange agreement in which the library started to acquire the government publication in different topics, which makes the collection has become one of the most significant strengths of the Korean collection. Now our collection is most extensive and comprehensive collection outside of East Asia. The library has extensive collection, which include a variety of materials, such as more than 10,000 items and 281 serials and newspapers from North Korea. Let's get to the main part of the presentation, North Korean collection. The library contains one of the largest North Korean materials in the world, especially the one disappeared during the Korean War. The North Korean materials at the library are one of a kind, which may not be available even in North Korea. It makes this collection extremely rare and significant. Also, the library provides the researchers greater access to all the new North Korean materials freely. Because of these reasons, there's a high demand from researchers for access to these materials. When I started working at the library, I thought it would be straightforward to serve the users with the North Korean materials. But soon I realized it was anything but straightforward. It was quite complex. So 4 years since I started working at the Korean collection, I have worked on a few databases in order to render better service to our users, which include the Korean serial database and North Korean serial indexing database. First, Korean serial database. Korean serial database is a friendly, powerful reference tool. It provides researchers detailed information about rich and diverse serials at the Korean collection. It all starts with one inquiry. All North Korean serials list, please. After receiving the same question a few times, I knew I had to do something about it. Then we used the serial visual file like this image to serve the users. It was just impossible to respond to the request. So we pulled all the Korean serials at the library, over 7,000 titles, and then we developed the Korean serial database. By reviewing each title, assign the country code, and add a subject by the LC code number and titles in Korean characters. Let's look at one example why Korean serial database is a powerful reference tool. Cholima, this is a frequently used North Korean serial. Probably you know the title. When we pull its record, LC subject heading is Korean North periodicals. As you can see, there's not talking about that much subject. This is only say this is a periodical from North Korea. Korean serial database enable researchers to search using all field, Korean title, and title, issuing body, publisher, and newspaper, and the subject heading, which add value to searching the database. By using advanced search, you can limit the search to both Koreas or just North Korea or South Korea. Let's just search serials and technology published just from South Korea. We retrieved the total 175 result. And from this list, let's click one title to get to the short list. From short list, by clicking the LCCN number, which is the Library Congress control number, you can get to the full record. When you have a full record, always make sure go to the bottom to get our full holding information. And now you can get all North Korean serials list with just one click on the browse option, because if you remember, we review and assign the country code for each serial title. Let's move to the next part of the presentation. Briefly, I'd like to talk about how to search the books from North Korea. The Library Congress cataloging record contains approximately 17 million records, representing books and serials or cartographic materials, manuscripts, so forth. It includes also 3.2 million records from an earlier database. This record, mostly books and food serials, and cataloged between 1898 and 1980. We call this record as a pre-mark record. Searching the pre-mark records is much more complex, which means when you search the books published before 1980 can be challenging, including North Korean materials. Let's see one example. 남조선 괴뢰도당의 자유민주주의 체제의 반동적 본질. How do you search this book from North Korea? Let's check its record first. This was the original record, which was pre-mark record when I found it accidentally. I could not see any country code. There was not much publication information besides it published 1975, and then PNJIL. Definitely there was a typo. I wonder what was PNJIL. So I went to the stack, locate a book, and manually modify this record by adding KN for North Korea, and then correct the typo. PNJIL was a 본질, PONJIL, and then add a publication information from the book, published in Pyongyang and 사회과학출판사, and change the whole thing information from general collection to Asian collection. Modify record manually. Modify the pre-mark record manually seems like the only option we have now. These are some of the common issues of a pre-mark record. Many of them does not have a country code or no publication information, not much subject, and wrong holding information, and wrong spelling, and then inconsistent with the spacing practice. So when you search for the North Korean book from the Library of Congress online catalog, we recommend use these tips to make your search more efficient. First, use advanced search and enter your search terms such as a subject and leave a Boolean operator and then put the Pyongyang as a publication information. This is very important. Let's see how it works. So we like to retrieve North Korean book on politics and government. Sorry, I was ahead of it. And then enter North Korea as a publication information because we like to get a North Korean book. So it's a natural, right? Natural reaction. But actually, this is a common mistake the user do. So when we did this search, we retrieved only 13 results, which include 3 films from North Korea, 2 films from Japan, 4 books from South Korea, 4 books from Washington, D.C. We could not find any book from North Korea from this search. So this time, we typed the politics and government as a subject, and then Pyongyang as a publication information. From this search, we retrieved 275 records, and then we found the books record we are looking for. So 남조선 괴뢰 도당의 자유민주주의 체제의 반동적 본질. So please make sure add a Pyongyang as a publication information. Lastly, North Korean Serial Indexing Project, NKSIP. The Asian Division at the Library of Congress has rolled out North Korean serial database online indexing tool. The database offers researchers enhanced access to periodicals and articles published from North Korea. Currently, there are 34,000 article index in 21 North Korean serials that are now searchable for the first time. In the past, there were no indexing resources at the article level for the North Korean serials anywhere in the world. So without specific bibliographic information, user has to browse numerous titles and issues to find the specific issues, articles they want. Access to the index to this historical and cultural material offers insight into the policy, economic, political, social, historic, military, legal, and financial and government issues that affect the contemporary foreign policy and strategy related to North Korea. We start this project with the following goals: to build the article level index for the North Korean serials in the Library of Congress and make that index available online for researchers and scholars. It is not surprising that more and more graduate students and scholars are taking a deep interest in North Korea because they know they can find the primary source information on North Korea at the Library of Congress. So let's give you one example. For example, you are looking for any article or information education in South Korea. You go one of any database, like a Procast education. You search the education in South Korea. There are over 13,000 search results, way too many results. So you can modify your search, or you can use advanced search and narrow down the result. You may find an interesting article and can request article because of citation information. But for the North Korean serials, that was not the case in the past. Now this enhanced database lets you study North Korea in unusual depths, provide a range of benefits. You can search, browse, sort, and narrow down the result. Researchers can search everything in database or limit the search to article title or subject or article keyword, publication date, and publisher. Or user can also browse by author by subject and serial titles. Selected article can be accessed on site at the library. Subject search. To search by subject, you may enter any term or phrase and choose limit by search. A subject. Alternatively, you may select browse by subject. We tried the subject search with women, and we retrieved a total 1,262 results. You can sort by title, name, date for all searches. Especially date sort will be really helpful in this case, dealing with this many results. Let's open the first article, 국제 여성 운동 소식. So this record shows title in Korean, romanized title, publication information, and publisher, and then citation, which is, this article is from 조선 여성, published 1949, volume 10, page from 96-99. From this point, you can request article with this citation information. Browse authors. Since we don't know that many North Korean authors' name, browse authors can be very useful, which has over 21,800 names in Korean and romanized Korean form. So we retrieved 8 articles on the name of Kim Il. Kim Il was the one who joined the arms resistance against Japan with the Kim Il song. Also, you can use a Boolean operator. Let's see a few examples. So we are looking for article with economics as a subject and published in 1958. We retrieved 757 articles. And this time, we like to have an article only related to South Korea. So we enter economics and uppercase N in 1958, uppercase and Namjoseon. We got 12 articles. As you can see, you can take advantage of article advanced search figure like other databases. This is a very exciting feature for the North Korean series, which was not expected to do in the past. Of course, if you have a time, you can browse all articles index. Currently, we have 44,249 articles because the alternative title, even though we made 34,000 articles, we have more titles. Search by publication date. You can search article from particular year or years by entering the years, limit the search to publication date. To search for article in a range of years, use a square bracket and uppercase 2. You can also add a not in uppercase to skip the year. So for example, I tried to search the article published from 1950 to 1953, but not 1952. So I use a square bracket, 1950, uppercase 2, and then add uppercase not to skip the 1952. Here are the 244 results from this search. And again, you can sort by title, name, and date. Also, you can search 도표, 그림, 시, 표, poster, painting, anything you can think of on the everything option. So as a study of North Korea is gaining more popularity among scholars and graduate students, this unique and abundant resources at the library will play a significant role in supporting scholarship in this field. North Korean serial collection is one of our popular collections, so digitization of these collections is the library's top priority in the future. If you have any questions or concerns, let me know, or you can send it to me through the Ask a Librarian. And then this concludes my presentation, but I display some of the books and series from North Korea. Please take a look if you have time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for coming here, and thank you for inviting me. My talk is going to be a little different than hers. I'm not going to talk so much about the records, but more about the procedures to gain access to the records. As was mentioned in the introduction, my name is Eric Van Slander. I work at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. Has anyone been to the National Archives? Okay, good. 2 people, 3 people, good. Has anyone been to the National Archives in DC? Oh, okay, great. So yes, the records I'm going to talk about today are held in College Park, Maryland. And what I'm going to do today is first, I'm going to give a brief introduction on how to conduct research at the National Archives in College Park. Second, I'm going to talk a little bit about the captured Korean records, particularly how we got them, what they contain, and how they're arranged, again, just very briefly. And the third thing is a procedural thing about how to actually request the records that interest you. Now, first of all, who can access records at the National Archives? The short answer, anyone. You don't need to be an American citizen. You don't need to present credentials. You don't need letters of recommendations. The only thing you would need to do would be to show up in person, either at our Archives 1 facility or our Archives 2 facility. And you would do this on a weekday starting from 8:30 on. And in order to register, you would simply have to produce a photo ID, meaning like a driver's license, your work ID, school ID, that kind of thing. You would then complete a short form where you provide your personal information, your address, telephone, and a brief description of your research topic. The third thing you would do once you would get there would be to view a computer-based research orientation. And basically, it's just telling you how to properly use archival records, how to safeguard those records, the basic rules, procedures, and practices. Before I go any further, does anyone know the basic difference between an archives and a library? Okay, the basic difference is libraries tend to keep secondary source published materials. Archives, for the most part, tend to have primary documents. In the case of the National Archives, these are primary documents produced by US government executive branch agencies, or in the case of the captured Korean records, records that were captured by people employed by the Commander-in-Chief, meaning the US Army, in North Korea. And after you've done the research registration process, the last thing you do is sit for your photograph, so dress up nicely however you want to be, and that card is going to be good for a year. There are no fees charged, either for registering as a researcher, and there are no fees for the support that people like myself will supply to you. There are staff on hand when you get there, but it's not a bad idea to let us know in advance before you come. At the end of my presentation, I'll have my contact information up, but also at the end, feel free to stop and ask me for a card. I would be more than happy to help you. As I said, our research room hours are Monday to Friday, 8:45 to 5:45. In the past, we had Saturday hours, but due to budget issues, we have eliminated those, and we're open Monday to Friday. If you are in DC, probably the easiest way to get to our facility in College Park, which is right next to the University of Maryland, is to take a free shuttle service. And we have a free shuttle that runs between our Archives 1 facility and Archives 2. For those of you who prefer to drive, we have free parking, but come early because parking is a little limited. Unlike some places, we have set times for requesting records at the National Archives in College Park. There are 3 request times in the morning and 3 request times in the afternoon. So keep this in mind as you're planning a day of research at the National Archives, as James will probably tell you. So get there as early as you can, get registered, and after you submit your request for records, it takes usually about an hour for you to get your records. So it can take, the better part of the half of a day to really get rolling. And at each request time, you can request up to 16 boxes of records. And I'll explain what one of these boxes looks like later. And if you want more information about doing research at the National Archives, there is a link to our website. And it talks about what you can bring with you, what you can't bring with you, and these types of things. Okay, as I said, my main purpose in being here is to tell you about the Record Group 242 National Archives collection of foreign seized records from the Korean War. As you all know, during the Korean War, U.S. forces moved rather quickly up through the Korean Peninsula, up to the Yalu River. During that time, tens of thousands of pages of documents were collected at various cities all along the way. I think the bulk of what we have was captured in the capital, in Pyongyang, but there were also things captured in Seoul and elsewhere along the way. The documents in this large collection span basically the period 1921 to 1952, and they cover numerous subjects, but most of these subjects are pertaining to the Soviet Union and North Korea. These records consist of a variety of types of things, everything from official correspondence to office files, personnel files, printed materials, things like books, periodicals, magazines, newspapers, bulletins of various types, photographs, propaganda leaflets, things like that. Okay, the great majority of the records that were captured are in either Russian or in Korean. But there are also some materials in other languages, such as Bulgarian, Chinese, Japanese, Polish, Hungarian. Pretty much any type of printed material that would have been on the Korean Peninsula at the time could have gotten scooped up by UN forces as they headed north, basically. After these records were captured, the U.S. Army quickly spirited them off the Korean Peninsula to Tokyo, which is where the Far East Command Military Intelligence Division was. So those records were kept, these tens of thousands of pages of records were kept in Tokyo for basically spot intelligence. What was going to be useful for the actual fighting that was going on at that time in Korea. And after that, they were shipped by ship from Yokohama to Alexandria, Virginia. And once they arrived in Alexandria, Virginia, they were held for a bit longer for more detailed analysis by the Army and other sort of CIA-type agencies for any intelligence that might have been in there. And then after the intelligence agencies finished with these records, in 1958, they were transferred to the National Archives. Now, originally, these records were held at a facility in Suitland, Maryland, because the building, Archives 2, where I work, had not been constructed in 1958. In the 1990s, when my building was built, those records were transferred out to us. The records are hard to use. Reason for that being, as James will attest, is that they are not arranged by subject. They are instead arranged according to the way they were shipped. Okay, which makes it quite challenging. Now the Army, which makes things difficult always, attempted to impose intellectual control over the documents, because you have these tens of thousands of pages of documents, what's in them? A lot of people can't even read the language, but in an attempt to get control of it, they basically set up these inventories where the shipment number or shipment advice would have been indicated, the original box number, which would have been like a big sort of a Foot Locker type box, and then the documents were simply numbered, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that kind of thing, okay? And that's how the documents are arranged. these inventories that the Army created were later microfilmed and actually came to us with the records. Okay, so these badly arranged records, how do you request them? You don't just want to randomly start with box 1 and start looking. Not a good use of your time. You're all very busy people, I know that. What you do, step 1, is you come to College Park and you go to the 4th floor, which is the microfilm research room. And that is where you will gain access to the microfilm copies of these shipping lists that the Army had composed. The microfilm publications at the National Archives all have numbers assigned to them. In this case, it's microfilm publication M1950, and it has a really sexy title, Shipping Advice List for Records Seized by U.S. Military Forces During the Korean War, 1950-54. But that's the first step to getting access to the records. Okay, what I've done there, in nice and grainy for you to look at, this is a screenshot from one of the microfilm lists. And what I've done, I've circled in red the important information, which allows you to request the document that you would like to see. As you can see, the shipping advice number, in this case, is 2005. That is the shipment number. And then box 1 of the shipment and item 1 within there. And you can see that it has information in English about what the documents being described are. And just for keeping it simple, I circled the first one. And this is a printed book, a 486-page document in Korean, as you can see at the top, that was captured in Pyongyang. Now, if you actually were interested in that book, then the next step would be, okay, there are 2 ways to do it. And unfortunately, the National Archives catalog is nowhere nearly as nice and well organized as the Library of Congress, full disclosure. But hopefully the link will work. What I've done is found the catalog entry for the records being described in the microfilm I just showed you. As you can see, yes, Korean language publication, records captured at Pyongyang, record group 242, and then this is a long list of sort of the records in this collection of records. Okay? Now, this information basically comes from the microfilm, which I just showed you a shot of earlier. Now, since you know the number, the shipping advice gets us into this particular entry, and we know that it's box 1, item 1. So if you scroll way down to the bottom of the page, you see listings of boxes, okay? See right here, the SA number is the first thing, and box 1, item 1 is going to be in container or box number 36. So this is how we would then take it to the next step and order the records. I will show you how to do that shortly. And full disclosure, please contact us before you try to do this on your own. This is not an easy thing to do. Okay? All right. So I'll try to make it easy, though. So now that you know the record group number, the entry number, and not the original box that was shipped from Korea number, but the box that NARA keeps the records in, box 36, we can take it to the next step. Oh, and also, in addition to the National Archives catalog, there are actually, for the use of researchers, 2 Korean language secondary source reference books done by Korean scholars that also help you to gain access to the records. It's not for everything, but they've selectively gone through and sort of thematically in certain subjects. So that's also a good thing to use. I think, James, when you were there, did you have a chance to use? Yeah, and that's a good, and again, that's not a National Archives product. That's a product done by Korean scholars. I think I lost my, now we're back, okay. Okay, so now that we know the original information, the current information in terms of the box entry, the next step is to fill out a reference service slip, or a pull slip as it's called. And that is something that would have information we saw on the previous page. And this is something, unfortunately, unlike some places, that must be done in person at the National Archives. This is not something you can do prior to going. You need to do it in person. And then once you fill out this slip with our expert guidance, then you submit that slip to one of the staff members, not at the microfilm section, but downstairs on the second floor, where you would actually request your records. Now, this is what a reference service or pool slip would look like. The stuff I circled in red is the information we've gleaned from the catalog page a couple of pages earlier. So again, this is something, your first time there, don't worry, we're not going to let you on your own. We will help you to do this and request the records that you would seek. Okay, and at the end of this long, laborious process, hopefully, yes, you will have a box. Okay, at the National Archives, you are, even if you're only after one document or one file or one book, you're requesting the entire box. And this is an actual box. I went into the stack areas the other day and took a picture. And this tells you that, yes, this box contains record group 242, the entry, and the series of shipping advice numbers. So one of these boxes contains approximately 1,000 pages. Again, you don't have to look at everything. You're more than welcome to browse, but you know, it is a pretty time-consuming thing. And as I said previously, it takes about an hour for your 1 or 16 boxes, however many you choose to order. Okay, now you have your boxes, you found your documents, what next? The next thing you can do, we have self-service photocopiers, which are also scanners. You can either make photocopies of the records, 25 cents a page. Your researcher card functions as a debit card. You can deposit money and do it that way. If you bring your own USB drive, you can plug it into our machine, but we'll still charge you 25 cents to scan. I don't make these rules. But the most popular option these days are for people to bring either their smartphone or a digital camera, and you can actually take pictures of the records. If you are taking a lot of pictures, we can provide you with a camera stand so you can click, 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 click away. That's something that's free as long as it's non-flash. You can bring a flatbed scanner. Some people like that to get really nice flat images. As long as it's sort of pre-approved, you can bring the flatbed scanner. The link in how to conduct research, that will tell you what you can and what you can't bring. If you're unsure, let us know. We'll say yes or no. But basically, any flatbed scanner that does not have a feeder on it is acceptable. If you're running out of time and you want us to make copies for you, we'll do it. 80 cents a page, not cheap. Very few people do this option. And this is our break-even number, by the way. We don't make a profit. The next thing that people actually do a little bit more, and if you go onto our website, there are lists of researchers for hire, and they will do research. They're not our employees. These are private people who just list their information on here, and you can reach out to them, tell them what you're trying to do, and then negotiate a price, basically. So that's the other option that you can take. Okay, that's basically what I have. Yes, and now it's time for questions. Yes.
In terms of like running out of time, do you guys have the option to then, if you do check out 16
Oh,
boxes,
yeah.
save it for the next day?
Thank you for bringing it up. Actually, I meant to mention that. Okay, on day one, you get there, you start using your records. 5:45 is fast approaching. They're flickering the lights. Okay. Yes, you can save records until the next day. Actually, you can save. You don't even have to come back the next day. You can save them for 3 days or even 5 if you plead your case and say, I really need 5 days, type of a thing. Yeah. So you can definitely. You don't have to rush and finish on that day. Okay. Yes. Yes.
Can we use it in publications?
Oh, yes. Unless you have problems with the North Koreans and their copyright laws, I don't know. No, I mean, only half jokingly. Most of what we have at the National Archives has no copyright restrictions. If there is a question, if it was a secondary source that was in something that was captured, it's basically up to you to work that out. But you don't need permission from us. The only thing we ask, if you're going to publish an image of a document or something else, photograph, whatever, give a good citation because, you know, which record group it comes from, which entry, which box, because we have no ability to go in and search at the document level our records. So that's like on a daily basis, we get emails with like a scan of a document saying, I want a copy of the rest of this, where is it? And we really, really have a hard time tracking that kind of stuff. So yeah, the short answer is there are no restrictions, but please cite the document in terms of, and on our website, there's also sort of a format on how to properly cite our documents and that kind of thing. So, okay. I know we have a Q&A period at the end, so if you have other questions, please feel free. Thank you.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm James Person, NCNK member and faculty at Johns Hopkins SAIS here in Washington, where I teach the Korea Studies classes. I am today going to talk about materials from other countries about North Korea. You've heard about materials that the North Koreans produce, periodicals, and primary source documents. While these provide great front door access to North Korea, to learning about, Sonia gave some examples of things to learn about North Korean society, about North Korean culture, history, politics. We also have great backdoor access to North Korea through the materials that were produced by embassies in Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, throughout the Cold War era. For about a decade, a little over a decade, I oversaw a project at the Woodrow Wilson Center that systematically went into the archives of North Korea's former communist allies. Some of the countries that we were in were in the Russian archives, Chinese, the East German archives, Polish, Hungarian, Bulgarian, Mongolian, Czech archives, gathering materials that, again, are produced largely in North Korea, and then dispatched back to foreign ministries. You have among these materials records of conversations between North Korean officials and their interlocutors in North Korea, including, for example, the ambassadors, but also you have working level diplomats meeting with North Korean officials. So you have many different levels of meetings. You have, again, the very high level meetings between, say, Kim Il-sung and the Soviet ambassador, and then you have an embassy counselor meeting with somebody talking about the quality of concrete being used to form the foundation of the newly built annex to the Soviet embassy, something along those lines. So you have many levels of talks, and records are kept for all of these meetings. You also have these diplomatic cables that are being produced in the embassies by diplomats who are there to really observe what's going on in the country and then to report about these and send these detailed cables back to their embassies describing developments in the country, developments in North Korea's domestic situation and as well as North Korea's relations with their allies. These are just a few. some documents I had sitting around the house last night that I snapped some pictures of. You have, for example, these are Soviet records from 1954. You have, for example, a record of conversation with the ambassador of North Korea, or the North Korean ambassador to the Soviet Union, a guy called Lee Sang-jo. And then you have a Soviet report on classes and class warfare in the DPRK. These are, as you can, well, this conversation here with the Soviet or the North Korean ambassador to Moscow, I should add that we also have records of conversations that took place in other countries, so that involved North Korean officials. So it's not just the conversations that occurred in North Korea, but for example, when a meeting occurred with the North Korean ambassador in Moscow, you would have a record of that. If a delegation from North Korea would travel to other countries, then you'd also have the full records of those meetings included in the files from the files on North Korea from these archives. Some of the things we can learn about North Korea from these materials are we can learn a lot about North Korea's foreign relations, a lot about their domestic politics, about economic policies, military developments, and a lot about North Korean society. There were some limitations, as many of you I'm sure are aware. The North Koreans were not always open even to their allies, and there were times when the North Koreans were in conflict with their allies. So, for example, in the early 1960s, the relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang soured, and that meant also that the relationship between Pyongyang and most other Central and Eastern European allies that were closely allied with the Soviets also were not good. So in times like these, the quality of reporting could sometimes suffer, but these diplomats that were based in North Korea were actually quite skilled at gathering information and would often compare notes. And one former East German ambassador to North Korea described it as really picking up pebbles here and there and assembling a mosaic by getting together with your friends and comparing notes. And you often find among the records records of conversations between other diplomats that are stationed in North Korea. So, for example, you may have a large group. You have regular meetings that occurred between East German, Russian, Czech diplomats, where they would really share notes on what they were experiencing in the country and try to develop a better sense of developments in the country. And this is especially helpful when the materials that the North Koreans themselves produced don't really provide or shed a lot of light on developments in political conflict, for example. In, say, 1956 or 1967, these are periods that I'm working on, you don't have a lot of information about, other than these reports that denounce the activities of these individuals who are eventually purged. Well, we get a better sense by looking at the conversations that these diplomats are having, and then the cables that they're producing, what was actually going on, and what issues were at stake. Was it simply, as is the standard narrative, a factional struggle, or were there principled policy positions at stake? These are things that we can begin to understand by looking at some of these materials. So there's a lot of use to them for the historian. These materials force us to step back and ask some basic questions, basic epistemological questions about how knowledge about North Korea has been produced and how we know what we think we know. And I'm using these to really challenge a lot of things that we thought we knew about North Korean history. Things, I mean, as I mentioned factions. I mean, this notion that you had, after the Korean War, this intense factional rivalry, where you had a Soviet faction, a Chinese faction, and then Kim Il-sung's group, and Kim Il-sung skillfully played these factions off one another until his power was unassailable. This is the standard narrative. What we see, if you really interrogate these materials, though, is that it wasn't so simple. You had